Welcome to a dialogue on democracy. Very important question. First of all, I would like to acknowledge the host for this event, China Public Diplomacy Association. This event is co-hosted by China Forum of Tsinghua University. My name is Wang Guan. I'm a news anchor and host with China Global Television Network. I was a former Washington correspondent for CCTV. And before that, I was one of you guys actually working for the Associated Press as a news intern 15 years ago. Now, I would like to begin by acknowledging the distinguished panel of guests and panelists with us today, joining us online and here on site. They are Mr. Yucheng, Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs of China. Eric Lee is Vice Chairman of the China Forum at Center for International Security and Strategy at Tsinghua University. And Professor Zhang Weiwei is Dean of Fudan University's China Institute. Also joining us online, we have KISHORE MAHBUBANI, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Institute from National University of Singapore. Welcome, sir. Also Martin Jakes, former Senior Fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. Hi, Martin.
Hi.
And last but not least, John Ross, former Director of Economic and Business Policy for the Mayor of London. Now, without further ado, I would like to invite Chinese Vice Foreign Minister, Mr. Yucheng, to say a few words. Let's welcome.
Very few countries are using democracy as a cover. They twist its essence and willfully set its standards. They even take democracy as a political tool for selfish gains and build small blocks to create division and confrontation, and build small blocks. So this obviously runs against the spirit of democracy. The first question I'd like to answer is China a democracy or not? Some in the West claim that there seems to be no democracy in China, and that the Communist Party of China is just authoritarian and autocratic. This actually reveals their hostile mindsets and intentions. Namely, democracy is just a tool to repress anyone who disagrees with them and to contain the development of other countries. China's democracy is not for the few or an interesting group. It is for the majority and the whole Chinese people. All the 2,620,000 deputies in the 5 levels of People's Congresses, from the National People's Congress down to provinces, cities, counties, and townships, are elected by people. The people in China participate extensively in state affairs, especially local level governance, to exercise their constitutional rights. China's democracy is not a show or a formality. It truly makes the people happy and improves their well-being. In the past decades, more than 800 million Chinese have been lifted out of abject poverty, a miracle unseen anywhere in the world. China has also built the world's largest social security system and healthcare system, covering more than 1.3 billion people. Jobs are the most important part of people's well-being. More than 10 million new jobs were created each year for 15 consecutive years, a number equivalent to the population of a mid-sized country. So far, 1.08 billion Chinese have been fully vaccinated against COVID, and community workers in the 600,000 communities across China are keeping up to speed everyone's vaccination. China's democracy is not the kind that wakes up at the time of voting and goes back to dormant afterwards. Instead, it ensures that the Chinese people have the full right to know, to express, and to supervise. It means that the people participate in every part of democracy. So both history and reality have fully proved that China's model of democracy fits in well with its national conditions. It enjoys the support of the mass people. It is real, effective, and successful democracy. China is indeed, no doubt, a true democracy. China's success in democracy highlights an important lesson, that is, transplanted democracy does not work, and countries should not be lectured about how to build their own democracy. In other words, for democracy to succeed in a country, it must take deep roots in that country. As the saying goes, that personality is shaped by the environment. 一方水土养一方人. Democracy should also be molded by the conditions on the ground. No two leaves in the world are completely the same. Likewise, a one-size-fits-all model of democracy for the whole world does not exist. There is no democratic system that can claim to be perfect or superior to others. Our world is going through a serious pandemic and deep changes unseen in a century. Humanity faces unprecedented risks and challenges. Now more than ever, the world needs to come together and respond collectively. And a certain country is putting together the so-called Democratic Summit as self-styled leader of democracy. It divides countries into different levels of a hierarchy, labels them as democratic or undemocratic, and points fingers at other countries' democratic systems. It claims it is doing this for democracy. But this is, in fact, the very opposite of democracy. It will do no good to global solidarity, no good to cooperation, and no good to development. In today's world of uncertainties, fighting COVID-19 remains a top priority. The coronavirus has claimed over 5.2 million lives worldwide, and the US alone lost over 800,000 lives to COVID. This is heart-wrenching. This tragedy must not continue. According to the WHO, more than 80 countries are still unable to vaccinate 40% of their adults by the end of this year. Many of them are African countries. What is worse, the new and formidable variant Omicron is now posing a severe threat to the African people. To help address these challenges, China has been providing assistance to people in Africa. At the recent FOCAC, Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, President Xi Jinping announced major steps in support of Africa, including another 1 billion doses of vaccines to African countries, 10 medical and health projects, and 1,500 medical personnel and public health experts. The clock is ticking for all countries to work together to find a solution. Let us return to what democracy is really about. Get in touch with the people and do more to improve their lives. Thank you.
Now, thank you very much, Vice Minister Le, for that thorough introduction of China's view, the view of the Chinese government on what democracy is, and that definition, or a redefinition rather, of what Beijing believes is true democracy. Thank you very much. Thank you for taking time off your busy schedule to address this forum. Of course, around the world, democracy varies from regions, religions, and cultures. One of my favorite politicians, Lee Kuan Yew, once said, The ultimate test of a political system is whether it improves the standard of living for the majority of people, which inspires the question we're discussing today. What is more important, form of government or effectiveness of governance? Should we take a hard look at some of the things that we have been taken for granted, such as what is democracy, or rather, what should democracy be truly about? And for that, we have an exciting panel of experts on that. To start off, I would like to invite Mr. KISHORE MAHBUBANI, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Research Center from National University of Singapore. He published a book last year, and its name is Has China Won, in case you haven't read it. Mr. MAHBUBANI, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Anyways, I want to first begin by thanking Vice Minister Le for his very warm words of welcome. It's very good to meet virtually, even though we cannot meet physically. And I'm also very happy to be connected with my friends, Eric Lee, Chang Weiwei, Martin Jacques, and across this virtual realm. It's good to see you all. And I'm glad you cited Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in your remarks, because in a sense, I'm going to build on what you just quoted from him. When he said the test of a political system is whether or not it improves the lives of the majority of people. At the end of the day, that's the real test of a political system. And here, the key, my message, to put it very simply, and you will find, I confess to you, you'll find a lot of the data. I'm going to use some data. In case you're wondering where to get the data is taken from chapter 7 of my book, Has China Won? And I'm happy to announce it's also been published in Chinese now. I think the title is a bit different, China's Choice. But in chapter 7, you'll find all the data that I'm citing today, because I don't have PowerPoints to share them with you. And the main case I'm going to make to you is that the country that claims clearly that it is the mothership of democracy is the United States of America. And I'll say for many decades, the United States was in many ways the gold standard for democracy in many areas. But in recent times, clearly, the United States is not functioning as a democracy. It is functioning as a plutocracy, and I'll explain that. And I can tell you that many Americans themselves feel that something has gone wrong with their democracy. And just, by the way, just yesterday, Kennedy School's Institute of Politics came out with a new poll showing that 52%, more than half of the young people in the US believe that the country's democracy is either in trouble or a failed democracy, and only 7% said that democracy in the United States is healthy. And I would say this poll from the Harvard Kennedy Institute of Politics is a very significant warning sign, because quite often young people can see things more clearly than old people like me can. And the key point I want to make is that while you may think that this may be just a temporary downturn in the performance of American democracy, it actually may be much more serious. And my case is that it's become a structural problem. And just let me read a few sentences from chapter 7 of my book. What I say is, under the surface guise of a functioning democracy, with all the rituals of voting, America has become a society run by moneyed aristocracy that uses its money to make major political and social decisions. And this is the difference between a democracy and a plutocracy. A democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people. A plutocracy is a government of the 1%, by the 1%, for the 1%. And that's what the plutocracy is. And what is actually quite shocking about this development in the United States is that America's greatest political philosopher in the last 100 years is a man I actually met in Harvard. His name is John Rawls, and I wrote my master's thesis explaining the concepts of freedom and equality in the writing of John Rawls. And John Rawls said this in a very prescient fashion. 50 years ago, he said this, John Rawls said this. He said the liberties protected by the principle of participation lose much of their value whenever those who have greater private means, repeat, whenever those who have greater private means are permitted to use their advantages to control the course of public debate, unquote. So if money can control public debate, then money will take over the decision making. And unfortunately, the one decision that the Supreme Court made that was disastrous was a decision that is known as Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission in 2010. And that decision basically said, this is a rough summary, that money has the right to free speech. So just as human beings have a right to free speech, money has the right to free speech. And the result of that is that was the critical step towards creating a plutocracy instead of a democracy. And somebody else who said this is somebody very distinguished, you've all heard of him, Martin Wolf from the Financial Times said, and I quote him in this chapter, he says that the Supreme Court's perverse 2010 Citizens United decision held that companies are persons and money is speech. This has proved a big step on the journey of the US towards becoming a plutocracy. And if you have any doubts that money has taken charge of the political system, there are very serious academic studies that document how money has taken charge. And in particular, I cite two Princeton University professors, Martin Gylens and Benjamin Page. And what they say, and they measure, they are very careful measurements about whose preferences are reflected in the decisions made by the US Congress and US public institutions. And their conclusions, which they say, and I quote, the preferences of economic elites have far more independent impact on policy change than the preferences of average citizens do. And their conclusion, therefore, is this. In the United States, our findings indicate the majority does not rule, at least not in the causal sense of actually determining policy outcomes. So they say that while you have all the processes of democracy, like regular elections, freedom of speech and association, and all that, makes no difference. At the end of the day, the decisions do not reflect the wishes of the majority, the decisions reflect the wishes of a minority, and therefore that is a plutocracy and not a democracy. And of course, going back to the point that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew made, that you cited, and he said that the test of a system is whether or not it improves the livelihoods of the majority of people. But that hasn't happened. And another writer, Anand Giridharadas, a former New York Times columnist, has said, and these are his figures, the average pre-tax income of the top 10 of Americans has doubled since 1980. That of the top 1% has tripled, and that of the top 0.001% has risen more than sevenfold. And at the same time, the bottom 50% have not seen any improvement in their standard of living. So if you go by what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said, if the test of a democracy is whether or not it improves the livelihoods of the majority of the people, there is overwhelming data that shows that the livelihood of more than 50% of Americans have stagnated for over 30 years, and the top 0.01% 0.001% have taken everything. So the net result of this, therefore, is that the United States, which used to be, I would argue, a strong, healthy, functioning democracy, has functionally become a plutocracy. And really, we need to understand what has gone wrong there, because if this is going to be the model of the rest of the world, then we have a problem. Why don't I stop here? I've used up my 10 minutes, and I want to thank you very much for inviting me to make this contribution.
Thank you very much, Professor MAHBUBANI. You brought up the concept plutocracy, actually reminding me of my days in Washington as a journalist. One of the first assignments of mine was to go to the Supreme Court of the U.S. And cover their Citizens United ruling. Was a split decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, which eventually allowed, basically allowed unlimited spending towards political campaigns by, corporations and special interests, and that really gave rise to super PACs. So one could ask the question that for average Joe in America or average Jane, how democratic is that? All right, thank you very much, Professor MAHBUBANI, once again for your speech. Eric, I'm curious about really your view on this very important subject of democracy.
Thank you, KISHORE. Thank you, Wang Guan. Thanks for having me here. I'm a businessman, so I'm not an expert. So today I wanted to focus more about democracy, and we'll talk about China a little bit too. We're having this discussion at it seems to me at a precarious time for democracy. Okay, Tunisia. This one country, all right, that's where the Arab Spring began, as we know, as the Jasmine Revolution, okay? So before, it was characterized as a dictatorship, of course. So according to the Freedom House, look at that, 2000, before the Arab Spring, not democratic, not free, red, bad, okay? And then, of course, Jasmine Revolution, the scores have improved to partly free. Then it got even better. All green light going on, looking really good for Tunisia, right? According to the Freedom House, democracy is triumphing. Yet, look at that. The people in Tunisia are miserable. They hate it. As the Freedom House numbers show improvements, significant improvements, the people of Tunisia are suffering. Their views are opposite. What is going on here, right? Now, this is from Pew Research, and they stopped collecting data at 2016. I don't know why. Maybe it's just too embarrassing. But my guess is after 2016, according to what I read in news reports, it's gotten even much worse. So I drew two red lines to show my guesses, okay? It's been going down precipitously, and now we have a new regime. In this guy, I forget his name. So I'm not predicting whether this new guy is going to succeed or fail, okay? I'm just saying there's a big change because it's been so bad. And of course, as you know, Tunisia was where Arab Spring began and was billed as the shining example of the Arab Spring, and then later the only success story of the Arab Spring. Okay, so this is Tunisia. So it's very confusing, right? What is going on here? I mean, why are all the data and the facts are so confusing? What is going on with democracy? So I went and studied the methodologies that are being used by Freedom House and VDAM and those institutions when they evaluate democracies. And I found something very interesting. They only measure a particular set of institutional procedures, okay? And these procedures strikes me as very specific to liberal politics and liberal societies, okay? Certain kind of elections, freedom of press, just liberal values, okay? So it seems to me that the disconnect is maybe they're measuring liberalism, not democracy. So they're measuring one kind of democracy called liberal democracy, and at that, they're only measuring the liberal part. My hypothesis is, now, is it possible? Is it possible? The problem today is liberal regimes are failing democracy. Because like as liberal societies led democratic progress in the world for some time. Okay, and we've got to credit liberal societies for that, but now liberalism is failing democracy. So I want to venture a solution too. We can't just measure procedures. Okay, if you look at these VDAM and Freedom House, they only measure procedures. The one thing they never measure is outcome or result. Okay, consider measuring outcomes. Is the system delivering democratic outcomes? Democracy's normative end must be to deliver satisfaction to a vast majority of the people over long duration, right? Otherwise, what are we in it for? What good is a set of procedures if it results in undemocratic outcomes? What's good is an election if elections keep producing incompetent leaders? What's good about judicial independence if it protects only the rich? What's so great about freedom of the press or freedom of speech if it leads to division and dysfunction in societies? So I think we ought to measure, we should venture, we should explore, we should have at least a dialogue, a discourse around the world about how to measure democracy by outcomes. Are the people satisfied with how they're governed? Are they optimistic about the future? Is your society cohesive? Are you better off than before? Is your country investing enough for future generations? Or are they just spending future generations' money? Okay, all these things, I just read there's a Chinese scholar at Beida, I forget his name, who's suggesting that there should be a social mobility index. That sounds right to me. Is your society socially mobile? That should count as whether your system is generating democratic outcome. So I think I'd like to use this opportunity to suggest a new discourse around the world. I think there was a great American leader who said, let's make the world safe for democracy. I think now we need to make democracy better for the world. If they don't act now, they are in danger that liberal societies, the word liberal, will no longer deserve to be followed by the word democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think many would question, are you really just a venture capitalist? Because you put forward some very interesting political science theories out there, hypotheses rather. To name just a few, you said whether liberal regimes are failing democracy. That's a really interesting hypothesis.
In the next episode of The Hub, we'll bring you the second half of this forum. Stay tuned.